Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 11 of our reading of A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent. It is a book by Marie Brennan. Anyways, we're going to go over the copyright information as usual. Let's see. Let me find it in the book first. It's on the screen currently. And it says here, A Natural History of Dragons. Copyright 2013 by Brennan Noonschwander. All rights reserved. Interior illustrations by Todd Lockwood. Maps by Rhys Davis. Designed by Greg Collins. And so, yeah, in the last part, Lady Trent was captured by smugglers, basically. And now she's trying to find out where the dragons are and trying to convince them that she's just there looking for dragons. So we're going to see what happened. Let me go back to the page right here. Okay. He didn't doubt me, but he didn't entirely believe my words either, simply because they made no sense. Why do you care about dragons? I'm afraid, I stammered in trying to answer. Too many replies attempted to come out of my mouth at once. The scrimmage was won by a simple truth. With me, from the moment I held the little vinegar-soaked greenie in my palm, because they're beautiful, and for science, because we know so very little about them. I don't know why Lord Hilford chose Vestrana, except that he hates the desert, and it's relatively close to Skirland, as such things go, but I belatedly tried to gather my wits. We are here for scholarly purposes, I assure you. My father has some Mincergrad brandy that may very well have come through these mountains by, shall we say, an unofficial route. He would not thank me if I interfered with your work. My unwise reference to that work hardened his face, but it did not produce violence as it might have done. The leader sat back on his heels, pulled the kerchief through his fingers as if to smooth it out. You said 3 others, I nodded. All here to study the dragons? I nodded again, and he glanced over at his companions. Not the young lover. The other man knelt to mutter in his ear, and between the low volume and the dialect I could not catch a word. Leader scowled, and I tensed, but the scowl, it seemed, was not for me. Your friends, he said, addressed me. They can make these dragons stop attacking people? My gaze slid past him and to the other men. Now that I looked properly, I saw that one leaned on a crutch and that looked new cut, and the clothing from another was stained with the ominous amount of blood, like not his own. Of course, they would be in danger as much as or more than the people of Drustanev. Could we make the dragon stop? We had debated possible causes, but without observational data, it was all just speculation, and until we knew the cause, I could only guess at whether we'd be able to affect it. It is the prerogative of old women to give unlooked for advice. So let me offer you this, friend reader. When you are lost in the woods and your safe return to home depends on telling a Stolleran smuggler that you can help him, that is not the time for a scientific evaluation of your chances. It is the time for smiling and saying, yes, absolutely. The leader considered this and stood without reply and went off to the side, gathering his men with him. No one bothered to keep watch over me. There was no need. What was I going to do, run off into the night? I had no sense of which way Drusanov lay except downhill, and there were wolves and bears and in the mountains, not to mention angry dragons. My interlocutor had made some effort to speak distinctly while addressing me, but in conversation with his men, all dissolved into an incomprehensible smear. Besides, I rather thought it would not do to seem like I was eavesdropping. I occupy myself trying to straighten my nightgown and robe, then hunching over into the most heat-conserving position posture I could achieve. To my surprise, after a minute or two of this, a rough and smelly blanket was dropped over my shoulders. I looked up in time to see the young lover returning to the group. Even that small gesture of charity gladdened my heart and changed my perspective on these men. They were not the romanticized figures that you think of when you hear the word Stollerin or smuggler, but neither were they vicious cutthroats, ready to murder at the first opportunity. They were simply men, most on the youngish side, who had made their living by carting boxes of illicit goods through the mountains. It is a trade that had gone on for ages in this region, though the boundaries, goods, and carriers have changed with time and occupations go, it is nearly as venerable as sheep herding, and the local boyars rarely rouse themselves to stop it. Even the quote-unquote leaders seem to a democratic sort, consulting with his fellows before arriving at a decision. This did not take very long, though. Soon they broke up and he returned to kneel before me. At first light, he said, we take you back down to the village. You tell your men we want to meet with them at the spring below the cliff. Can you find the place? I had drawn it on the map myself. Yes. We want money, he said, and help. Money first, then we tell them where the dragons are. Then they quiet the beasts down. As long as they do that and don't try to interfere with us, we'll leave you alone. He hadn't named a figure, but bargain over the price of my safety was a task I would gladly leave to the gentleman. I understand. The smugglers reached out and untied my hands, then my feet. Get some sleep. He turned to go, and the words burst out of me, a deep-seated, skirling impulse towards good manners, entirely out of place in my current surroundings. I am Isabella Camhurst. He cast a glance back over his shoulder at me, eyebrows raised. Then a hint of a smile lifted the corner of his mouth. Chatskel, he said, only his given name. Well, I couldn't blame a criminal for not wanting to identify himself more than was necessary. Thank you, I said, as he went on his way. By then, it was long past the time that my midnight wakefulness should have ended. With my blood still racing, though, and the ground hard and cold beneath me, I did not manage a second sleep that night. Chapter 10. Let's see what we have here. My triumphant return, a productive meeting, and progress at last in our work. Sunrise, as seen from high on a mountain, is a truly glorious thing. The light cut like a knife blade through the trees, setting aglow the mist that had gathered in the valleys below. Its cold brilliance hurt my eyes, but I was glad to see it all the same. It meant that I would soon be going. Not home. In fact, that sleepless dawn in the mountains brought with it the strongest tide of homesickness I had ever felt. I often missed Skirland during my travels. There is a great deal to be said for the place where one need not think all the time about the right thing to do or say, but simply behave according to well-worn habit. And that feeling had never been more intense than on my morning with the smugglers, but I had spent enough time in Bretelkin's dark house for it to feel like the closest thing to safety I could find in Vistrana. I very much wanted to return. Okay. My cold, stiffened legs had other ideas. I tried to stand, failed entirely, and turned my back on the men so I could massage my calves and thighs into something resembling life. My feet remained frozen, but I could not bring myself to beg for stockings. No one gave me breakfast either. I suspected by their lean and hungry looks that they had little enough for themselves. Most of the men stayed behind. The leader and two others formed my escort. Each carried a rifle and a pistol, which I hoped were only for such wildlife as we might encounter on the way. I tried to return the blanket to the young lover with a smile and thanks in Irish, but he pressed it back onto me, and in truth I was glad for its warmth as we began to hike. At first, I was also glad to be traversing on my own feet rather than being carried like a sack of meal. 3 falls later, my joy had been firmly tempered. My cold feet were clumsy, and my attire, as I said before, was quite unsuitable. Clutching the blanket about myself meant I could not use my hands for balance until I knotted it around my shoulders like a lumpy shawl. I attempted to question the men about how they survived in the mountains, but was ordered into silence, and so we went down to Drustanev. Most of the way before we came within sight of the village, however, we heard sounds echoing up the narrow valley, shouts, and the barking of dogs. One of the men immediately grabbed my arms. The smuggler threw up a silent hand. I swallowed a moan as my slow, sleep-deprived mind realized what the racket must be. Jacob had turned out the population of Drustanev to search for me. Guiltily, I thought that this morning must have been. Guiltily, I thought what his morning must have been like. He awoke not long after dawn. I was not in bed. He went downstairs, thinking to find me, but found no sign. Dagmira or the cook might have arrived by then, and neither knew where I was. A quick glance would show that I had gone out without dressing. My tracks would lead out of the village, and then I had seen the care with which the smugglers broke and hid our trail on the way down. They might well have done the same during my abduction, which meant the search would not lead back to their camp. But to my husband, it would look like I had wandered inexplicably out of the village and vanished. And the most obvious explanation would be that I had been eaten by a dragon. My heart ached for the panic I must have caused him, ached and then tightened in fear for what might yet go further wrong. Let me go alone, I said in an urgent whisper. You don't wish to be seen, do you? I can find my way from here, and I'll send the men to meet you as planned. Daylight had revealed the leader's face more clearly, weather-worn features with blue Stolleran eyes and a fortnight's growth of beard. That latter did not obscure the clenching of his jaw as he considered me. You have my word of honor, I said, drawing myself up with as much dignity as I could manage in my current state. Whether the word of a skirling gentlewoman meant anything to him, or whether he simply decided it wasn't worth the trouble of keeping me, I'd not know, but he waved me on with a curt hand. Tomorrow, he said, as I passed him, the spring beneath the cliff. I resolved that someone would be there to meet him, if I had to go by myself. The barking grew louder, and I scrambled down toward the searchers, trying to put distance between myself and the erstwhile hosts before I drew anyone's attention. When I judged I had gone far enough, I began to shout, and soon they found me. I will spare you the tedious details of what followed. Much of it escaped me anyway, owing to my inferior grasp of Vestrani. For posterity's sake, however, I should note the reaction of 2 individuals upon my return. The first, of course, was Jacob, who was leading the search. His first action upon seeing me was to crush me in the tightest embrace he had ever shared, and if the blanket over my shoulder was damp by the time we parted, I made no comment on it. Thank the Lord, you're safe, he said, and then, on the heels of that, where in heaven have you been? He asked that question several more times before I managed to give him an answer, though not for a lack of trying on my part. Every time I opened my mouth, he declared anew his relief over my safe return, and soon this was further interrupted by orders to call off the search. We were halfway back to Drustanev. I had to insist to Jacob that I was perfectly capable of walking, or he might have carried me before I could say, it's quite complicated. It's quite a complicated story, and I will tell it. But perhaps we should wait until Lord Hilford and Mr. Wilker can also hear. But oh, Jacob, I have solved our problem. I know where the dragons are layering. Dragons! He exclaimed, stopping dead in a damp meadow. Isabella, what are you talking about? Were you attacked? No, no, I said, fending off a renewed attempt to check me for injury. He had already catalogued the various scrapes resulting from my falls and fussed over them as if they were a collection of broken legs. Rather, I don't know. Someone else does. I remembered that we were surrounded by men from Drustanev and stopped before I could say any more. We were speaking Skirling, of course, which I doubted any of the villagers understood, but better safe than sorry. Jacob finally agreed to wait for the full story, but I think it was more out of conviction that I was overwrought by my experiences than anything else. The other noteworthy reaction came later, after I had been fed, doctored, buried under a pile of fire-warmed blankets, and finally permitted to dress. Dagmira undertook this task and lambasted me up one side and down the other for my stupidity in going out like that. There was a man lurking about, I said in frustration, trying to stop her tirade, and indiscretion I had not meant to bring up. The man, and one that did no good. A man, of course there was a man, she said furiously. Everyone knows Rivaka has her lover. Ever since her husband died, one of those Stalaran smugglers. Anyone could have told you that. No need to go running around the mountains to find out. So much for my indiscretion in mentioning him. The smugglers, it seemed, were no secret at all in Drustanev, except, of course, where the Skirling interlopers were concerned. Would you have told me if I asked? Would anyone? Of course not, Dagmira snapped. It's none of your business. I forbore to point out that there was need to go running about the mountains. My fractured interactions, wow, that is a tongue twister, with Dagmira, nothing like so fluent as I represented them here, but for my reader's sake, I will not subject you to a reconstruction of my appalling grammar and circumlocutions, had made it clear to me that the villagers of Drustanev had very little understanding of, let alone sympathy for our reasons for being there. Grighelkin, I suspected, had not told them much, except that we intended to tramp around the mountains looking for dragons. As a result, we were an intrusion and imposition upon their lives, and the sooner we were gone, the better. As Dagmira said, their affairs were none of our business. I let her finish dressing me, and we went at last to speak with the three men whose affairs very much were my business, as mine were theirs. They let me tell my story in peace, barring the occasional yelp of alarm or disbelief from Jacob. He withheld actual comment until I was done, though at which point he dropped his face onto his hands. I should never have let you come here, he said, through their muffled barrier. I took no real harm, I said defiantly, a scraped knee at worst. And how much time have I saved you? We could waste the entire summer up here waiting for Mr. Gritelkin to come back. Well, this way we can get on with our research. If this smuggler can help, Mr. Wilker said, not to bother to hide his doubt, his trade may teach him a great deal about the mountains. But dragons? You can hardly know the one without the other, not if you wish to avoid being eaten, I said. Lord Hilford huffed thoughtfully, sending his mustaches fluttering. I tell you again, there is no that they do not ordinarily attack people, but we stand to lose very little by following this lead. Mrs. Camhurst has given her word that the men will be paid for her return. We cannot dishonor that. Furthermore, it sounds likely that the smugglers can can tell us more about the dragon's sudden aggressiveness, which will be of value even without directions to their lairs. Yes, it will do, he said, with a decisive air. Tomorrow we will go and meet them. I had, during our journeys, seen Mr. Wilker argue with other men, and often with me, but never with the Earl. You can't be serious trusting these fellows. Who said anything about trusting them? Lord Hilford asked in surprise. I intend to bring both of you with me, you and Camhurst both, and you can argue about who gets to skulk in the bushes with a rifle. Not you, though, Mrs. Camhurst, or your husband will have an apoplexy. I think that was rather unfair word for Jacob's sentiments, but it is true that his nerves haven't yet recovered from the scare. A part of me sorely wished to argue that I could mark the map, but any of the others could do that as well as me, only their marks would not be as elegant, and that argumentative part drooped its ears and tucked its tail between its legs upon the look in Jacob's eyes. I am not the sort of lady for whom protectiveness sets her heart aflutter, but the incident had revealed an intensity of feeling in my husband that took me quite by surprise. I had thought us friends, and so we were, but the word fell short of describing all. Indeed, the same night we discovered one of the primary uses for that wakefulness period between one's first sleep and one's second, the same use to which Rebecca and her young lover had put their time. Oh, for goodness sake, I had already spoken about my fears when facing the smugglers. Why should I not address the other side of that coin? It isn't as if the people reading this book are unlikely to be familiar with the activity, and if they are, I heartily encourage the adults among them to put the book down this instant and discover one of the simpler pleasures in life. I am a natural historian, I assure you. It is common to all species and nothing to be ashamed of. So for my husband's peace of mind, I agreed to be left behind. Okay, we're at 22. By dawn the next day, I was just as glad not to be going out to that spring. My stockingless feet had been rubbed raw by the hike down from the smugglers' camp. I padded about on our borrowed house in thick wool socks, a compromise between protecting my blisters and keeping my toes warm. I soon discovered, though, that the downside of sparing my husband's nerves, I quite destroyed my own. What do you know of these smugglers? I asked Dagmira as she beat out a rug on the slope behind the house. Her various looks were gradually becoming more familiar to me. I recognized this one as exasperation, and I should ask so stupid a question. I clarified. Are they violent men? Dagmira did not know. The gentleman had gone out to meet the smugglers. Or rather, I thought she did not know. The village gossips can uncover the strangest of things. At any rate, she seemed to take my question as an after effect of my own experience. They didn't hurt you, did they? They keep away from people, mostly, unless people chase after them. The barb sailed right past me. My attention was on her earlier words, so reminiscent of Lord Hilford's statement about the rockworms. Dragons have attacked people before, haven't they? I mean, in past years. Clearly, Dagmira had no idea why I had seemingly changed topics. You hear stories, she said with a shrug. A cousin's cousin from the next valley over. Wait. Okay. Does it happen on any kind of cycle? Generationally, perhaps? I stopped, for the exasperated look was back. Teach a dragon to hatch egg. I think that's hatch. Yeah. As they say nowadays. If the problem was anything like so regular, these people dwelling in the mountains for centuries would have noticed, but it hadn't happened in Drusenev before, at least not for a long time. When did it start? She delivered a particularly vicious blow to the rug, sending dust flying. Last autumn. Nebulous. Mating season, perhaps. We knew very little about dragon mating habits. We know very little about dragon anything, hence this expedition. But it would have taken Gretelkin some time to be sure of the problem, and by then the mountains would be all but impassable. So he waited for spring, which I still was not convinced had arrived. I could see snow not 100 feet from where I stood, and this sent his message. It was not his fault that the vagaries of travel and communication prevented him from warning us off. Pulling my notebook from my skirt pocket, I asked, "What about injuries or deaths?" Oh, wait. The thwack of Dagmir's rug beater punctuated her words, which came out tense with the force of it. 2 deaths, don't know how many hurt, half a dozen maybe, plus Mingello, the Chiaverin driver, averaged across 6 months. It was not so bad, but of course that did not tell me how many had narrowly missed harm. Dagmar, however, had redoubled her effort, and the noise prevented me from asking more. I tried not to calculate the odds of an attack on any given day, and refrained from asking whether a cousin's cousin from the next valley over had ever been killed by smugglers, and went back to pacing in my thick woolen socks. We're going to stop this right here. We have been reading from A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent, and it is a book by Marie Brennan. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me anyway, all the information will be in the description below. Also, you can join the Discord, and that information will be down there as well. Thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.